I have been asked more than once what it sounds like. People expect me to describe something grand. A chord struck across the sky, a note that shakes the ground. They want the thing to be enormous because everything else about it is enormous. The scale of it, the age of it, what it turned out to mean. They hear the story and they assume the sound that started everything must have matched the weight of what came after. It didn't. It was a hum, a low, even, patient hum, somewhere between the register of a ship's hull under thrust and the resonance of a struck bell, heard from 3 rooms away. You felt it in your back teeth more than you heard it in your ears. Most people filtered it out within the first day, the way you filter out the sound of recycled air in a sealed habitat, or the low moan of a cargo bay settling in low gravity. It became part of the background, part of the station's ambient noise. After a while, nobody talked about it at all. I never stopped hearing it. That is, I think, the beginning of the answer to everything that followed. My name is Rael Candor. At the time of which I am speaking, I was 41 years old, a survey linguist on secondment to the Colonial Cartography Division's Outer Reach program, stationed on a survey platform called Veth Station, a mid-tier colonial outpost on a plateau world, roughly 9 light months from the nearest settled hub. Veth Station had no strategic value, no mineral deposits worth extracting, and no population beyond the rotating crew of 37 specialists assigned to catalog the plateau's geographical and atmospheric anomalies. The pay was adequate, the posting was remote, the coffee was terrible, and the views were extraordinary. And I had taken the assignment because I needed to be somewhere very quiet for a year, and the plateau qualified. I had been there 3 years by the time things changed. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not a figure of speech. I signed on for 1 year, extended twice, for reasons that were professionally defensible. The catalog was incomplete. The linguistic dataset was richer than expected. There were inscriptions on the survey markers in a script that predated any known colonial writing system. But the real reason, the one I did not put in my renewal requests, was the hum. I could not leave while it was still speaking, and I had not yet understood what it was saying. Let me be precise about my training, because it matters. A survey linguist is not a codebreaker in the conventional sense. We do not sit at consoles running decryption algorithms. We work with language as a human phenomenon. We study the way meaning accumulates in sound and symbol, the patterns of grammar and syntax that different minds independently arrive at, the way a culture's structure shapes the words it builds. My particular specialty was dead language reconstruction, taking fragmentary inscriptions, partial records, the degraded remnants of writing systems that no living person had used in generations, and working backward from what survived toward what had originally been meant. I had done this with 17 distinct ancient writing systems across the outer reach worlds. I was good at it. I was patient with it in a way that most people could not sustain. The hum was not a language, or so I thought for the first 2 years. The Colonial Survey Service had sent a signals team to Veth Station 18 months before my arrival. They had placed instruments around the source of the hum, a construct buried to roughly 2/3 of its height in the plateau's mineral crust, roughly 4 meters tall at its exposed apex, its surface covered in a material that responded like no cataloged alloy, and run the standard diagnostic suite for 18 days. Their report described the signal as a repeating electromagnetic pulse in the 4 to 8 Hz range, consistent with what the instruments could measure, inconsistent with any natural geological or atmospheric source. They recommended further study and noted that the structure appeared to be of artificial origin. They could not determine the age reliably. The mineral crust surrounding it gave readings in the range of 40 to 60,000 years, which they described as an instrumental anomaly, because nothing built by any known civilization was that old. They were not wrong that it was an anomaly. They were wrong about the direction of the error. The signals team left after their 18 days. The anomaly was logged, tagged for follow-up study in the next survey cycle, and filed under the administrative classification that Colonial Survey used for things it did not know what to do with, but could not quite justify ignoring. The construct sat on the plateau as it had sat for however long it had been sitting there, and it hummed, and no one assigned to Veth Station paid it much attention after the first week. I paid it attention every day. My official work took me to the construct's location in any case. The inscribed survey markers I was cataloging were clustered in the plateau area, surrounding it, as if whoever had placed the markers had been orbiting something, measuring distances from a central point, building a reference grid with the construct at its center. I would set up my field equipment in the morning, work through the marker inscriptions for 6 or 8 hours, and then, at the end of the day, sit near the construct for a while before returning to the station. I told myself this was productive. I told myself I was observing the acoustic character of the signal in context, tracking whether the frequency shifted with atmospheric conditions or temperature differential, building a physical data set to accompany the linguistic one. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that sitting near it felt like something. Not comfortable, exactly. Not peaceful in any simple way. It felt like being in the presence of something that was attempting to communicate across a distance so enormous. In time, in scale, in the gap between whatever had made it and whatever I was, that the communication had been reduced to its most basic possible form. A pulse, a carrier signal. The electromagnetic equivalent of a hand pressed flat against a wall, feeling for vibration on the other side. Something was waiting, and it had been waiting a very long time, and I was not able to leave. I should tell you something about the language I grew up speaking, because that matters too. My mother was from a community that had maintained, across 7 generations of colonial diaspora, a linguistic tradition that official colonial records classified as a derivative of a regional pre-colonial Earth language, long extinct as a primary tongue. My mother did not think of it that way. She taught it to me not as a curiosity or a heritage exercise, but as a living practice. The language in which she prayed, the language in which she spoke to her mother, the language in which she thought when she was tired or frightened or very glad. It had a particular character, a grammar that built meaning through layers of relationship rather than through linear sequence, a sound system that used resonance and pitch as meaningful elements rather than just phonetic variation. I had written 2 academic papers on its structure. I had cataloged it formally. I knew it, technically, better than almost anyone alive. But I also knew it the way you know a voice. The way you know the particular quality of silence in a room where someone has just stopped speaking. Not as a set of rules, but as a presence, a shape in the air, something the body recognizes before the mind has finished processing. When the construct spoke to me, it spoke in that language. Not immediately, not all at once. That is not how it happened. Let me tell you how it happened. The day the frequency changed was the last scheduled workday before the decommission order. Veth Station had been flagged for resource reallocation. The Colonial Survey's outer reach budget had been cut twice in the preceding 2 years, and stations with low strategic priority were being wound down. Veth Station's crew of 37 would drop to a skeleton maintenance team of 4. The research programs would be suspended, and the anomaly file would be archived. I had been given 90 days' notice. I had used 87 of them, completing every piece of the catalog I could finish, writing up the marker inscription dataset in enough detail that whoever eventually returned to the station, if anyone did, would have a foundation to work from. On the 88th day, I went to the construct one last time. It was early. The plateau light at that hour had a quality I had never quite gotten used to. The sun on Veth's world was smaller and cooler than the standard references, and it rose through an atmosphere with a particular particulate character that diffused the light into something almost silver, clean and cold and very still. I had a thermos of the terrible coffee. I had my field recorder, though I did not particularly intend to record anything. I walked out to the construct the way I had walked out to it hundreds of times, And I sat down on the flat mineral shelf about 3 meters from its base, and I let myself be quiet. I was thinking about the markers. Specifically, I was thinking about a sequence I had never been able to resolve. A set of inscriptions on the markers closest to the construct, in the innermost ring of the reference grid, that did not follow the grammatical pattern of the outer markers. The outer markers were directional, navigational, the way a sailor's chart uses landmarks. But the inner ring markers used a grammatical structure that my 2 years of analysis had only partially decoded, a structure that appeared to be interrogative, not directions but questions. I had never been able to determine what they were asking. I was sitting there with that unresolved problem in my mind, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand when you are not quite ready to set it down. When the hum changed. Not dramatically. It did not shift pitch or volume in any way that would have alarmed a listener. It simply varied. The pattern that had been perfectly regular, the pulse that the signals team's instruments had recorded as consistent to within fractions of a percentage, introduced a deviation, a small one. Something in the 4-8 Hz range shifted, and the shift had a shape, and the shape was not random. I became very still. I had spent 2 years cataloging patterns in ancient writing systems, and the thing that my training had given me above everything else was the ability to recognize the signature of intentionality in a sequence. Random variation looks a certain way. Intentional patterning looks different, not always obviously, not always immediately, but different. The difference is in the repetition. Random sequences repeat elements, but the repetition is distributed according to probability. Intentional sequences repeat elements in ways that carry information, the repetitions spaced and weighted and shaped to mean something. The deviation in the hum was intentional. I sat very still for a long time, long enough for the silver morning light to shift towards something a little warmer, long enough for my coffee to go cold. I was listening with everything I had, not the instruments, not the recorder, just my body and my training, and the specific quality of attention that a linguist develops when they are in the presence of something that might be saying something, if only they can find the right way to listen. The deviation was not in the electromagnetic frequency the instruments could measure, or rather, it was. But the instruments were measuring the wrong layer. The instruments were measuring the signal the way you might measure the ink on a page without reading the words. The information was not in the frequency itself, but in the relationship between the frequency and the physical vibration it induced in the mineral crust surrounding the construct. I understood this slowly, and then all at once, the way a translation breaks open. The construct was not broadcasting a signal, it was broadcasting a question. And the question was encoded not in the electromagnetic pulse that instruments could detect, but in the physical resonance pattern that the pulse induced in the mineral matrix. A resonance that was, if you knew what to listen for, structured like language, like a very specific language. A language that built meaning through layers of relationship rather than linear sequence. A language that used resonance and pitch as meaningful elements. My mother's language. I put my hand on the construct. I want to be honest about what that felt like. Because I think the honest version is more interesting than the version I might be tempted to tell. It did not feel like destiny. It did not feel like confirmation. It felt like vertigo, the particular, disorienting sensation of realizing that the frame you have been using to understand something is the wrong size, and that the thing you have been examining is much larger than you thought, and that the scale error has been yours all along, not the thing's. The construct's surface under my palm was neither warm nor cold. It had a texture that I do not have a precise word for. Not rough, not smooth, something between porous and crystalline, as if the material at the surface existed at a scale that was slightly smaller than the scale at which materials normally had textures. It vibrated. The vibration was low and even, and it traveled up through my palm and along my arm and into the bones of my shoulder. And when it reached the bones, it was no longer just vibration. It was pattern, and the pattern was structured, and the structure was language. and the language was the one I had learned from my mother. I held very still. I breathed. I let the pattern come. It took a long time. I do not know precisely how long. My field recorder was still running, and when I checked it afterward, the elapsed time from when I sat down to when I finally stood was 6 hours and 42 minutes. But most of that time I experienced as something much shorter, the way deep concentration compresses duration. The sun had moved well past midpoint by the time I became aware of myself again as a body sitting on a mineral shelf on a cold plateau rather than a mind attending to a signal. What the construct had told me over those 6 hours was this: it was built. The word I am using is imprecise because the process it described was not what we mean by building. But I have no better word. It was built by a civilization that had existed in this region of space so long ago that the number of years means nothing to me in any visceral sense. The signals team's estimate of 40 to 60,000 years was not an anomaly. It was a lower bound. The actual age was longer by an order that I cannot represent here without it sounding like I am exaggerating, so I will only say longer. That civilization, and again I am using a word that is imprecise, because what they were was not quite what we mean by civilization, or at least not only that, had reached a point in their development at which the most urgent question they could identify was not strategic or territorial or technological. It was this, of all the minds that would ever come after them, which minds would still carry the capacity they considered most fundamental. The capacity that, in their understanding, was the root from which everything else they had built had grown. They did not have an exact word for this capacity in any language I can represent. In translation, the closest approximation I have been able to construct is something like the ability to be genuinely quiet, not silent, not passive, not merely still, but genuinely, actively quiet in a way that allows something very faint to be heard. The discipline of setting aside everything you think you already know about what a signal means, and listening for what the signal is actually saying, even when what it is saying does not match any category you already have. They had watched this capacity diminish across their own history. They had watched civilizations, their own and others, become progressively louder internally, progressively more certain about what things meant before those things had finished speaking, progressively less able to attend to anything that did not present itself in an already familiar form. They considered this the primary failure mode of any mind complex enough to build categories, because the categories eventually became walls. They built the construct as a filter, not a gate in the sense of something that blocks passage, a filter in the sense of something that selects. The signal it broadcast was a question, encoded in a form that could only be perceived as language by a mind that had maintained, whether through training, inheritance, practice, or some combination of all three, a specific kind of attentiveness, not intelligence in the conventional sense, not knowledge, not power, attentiveness, the capacity to be present to something that has not yet made itself obvious. The question, in the language of the inner ring markers, was something I can render approximately as, who still carries the frequency of the first mind, not the oldest mind, not the most powerful. The first meaning the quality of mind that precedes categorization, the mind that can attend to something genuinely unknown without immediately folding it into something already known. The construct had been asking this question for longer than my species had existed. It had been waiting, across all that time, for an answer. I want to dwell on this for a moment because I think it is easily misread. When I use the word quality, I do not mean virtue in a moral sense. The construct was not selecting for goodness or kindness, or any of the values we traditionally associate with being chosen by something ancient and powerful. It was not a test of character. It was not a test of worthiness. The civilization that built it was, as best as I can reconstruct from the translation work, deeply uninterested in those categories, not because they were immoral, but because their understanding of what made a mind fit for the encounter they were preparing for had nothing to do with the virtues we typically rank. It had to do with a single, specific, and very particular capacity: the ability to remain genuinely open to information before the mind has decided what the information means. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It is, in fact, one of the most difficult things a trained mind can do, because training necessarily builds categories, and categories necessarily shape perception. The more you know, the harder it becomes to encounter something genuinely unknown, because the brain's first response to any input is to match it to an existing pattern, and the more patterns you have, the more aggressively the matching happens. Expertise is, in a real sense, the accumulated tendency to see what you expect to see. The capacity the construct was looking for was the ability to know a great deal, to have genuine expertise, genuine depth, and yet to hold that knowledge lightly enough that genuinely new information could still land without being immediately categorized into something already familiar. This is not common. It is also not mystical. It is a skill developed through practice of a very specific kind. The signals team at Veth Station knew a great deal about electromagnetic signals. Their knowledge was real, and their instruments were good, and their analysis was correct. But their knowledge also gave them a complete and well-populated map of what an electromagnetic signal could be and what it could mean. And the construct signal did not match any position on that map, so they filed it accurately as anomalous, and moved on to things their instruments could characterize more fully. They were not wrong to do this. This is how science is supposed to work. You describe what you can describe accurately. You flag what resists accurate description, and you do not invent conclusions to fill gaps. But the construct was not looking for the absence of wrong conclusions. It was looking for the presence of a specific quality of attention, the kind that can sit with a gap and let it be a gap, without needing to close it, without getting bored by its unresolvedness, without treating the absence of an answer as evidence that there is no answer to find. I had spent my career in gaps. Dead language reconstruction is entirely gap work. You are always working at the edge of what the surviving evidence can tell you, always attending to the places where the record breaks off, always waiting for the pattern to emerge from the fragments, rather than forcing the fragments into a pattern you already have. The work built in me over decades a very high tolerance for productive uncertainty. Not knowing was, for me, interesting rather than uncomfortable. A question without an answer yet was a space to inhabit, not a deficiency to resolve. The construct had been waiting for someone who would not be in a hurry to leave that space. I sat with that for a long time after the construct went quiet. The vibration did not stop, but the language portion of it, the part that had been speaking to me, concluded. It concluded in a specific way. The resonance shifted into a pattern I recognized from the inner ring markers as a form of address, not a title in the political sense, not a designation of rank or lineage or blood, a designation of resonance, a statement that the thing transmitting and the thing receiving were, in some property that mattered to the transmitter, alike. The address was 2 words in my mother's language, rendered in the resonance grammar that used pitch and relationship rather than linear sequence. First mind. That was what it called me, not a king, not a maker of things, not an heir to a throne or a seal or a covenant of blood. A designation of quality, of capacity, of what kind of attention I had been carrying, without particularly knowing I was carrying it for my entire life. I sat on the mineral shelf with my hand still on the construct surface, and the silver-gold plateau light lying flat across the crust in every direction. And I thought about my mother sitting at her kitchen table with the window light coming in behind her, teaching me a language that I had understood, academically, as a dead dialect, and that she had understood as a way of being awake to the world. I thought about 17 ancient writing systems, and the particular quality of patience required to wait for a dead language to speak rather than forcing it to say what you expected. I thought about 3 years of sitting near a construct that hummed, listening without knowing what I was listening for, because the not knowing had not been for me a sufficient reason to stop. I thought about the signals team and their 18 days, and their instruments and their report that correctly identified the signal, and incorrectly concluded there was nothing more to know. I was not better than them. I want to be precise about that. I was not smarter or braver or more dedicated. I was differently trained, and the training had produced a specific habit of attention, and the habit had been, as it turned out, exactly what had been required. I had not come to Veth Station looking for this. I had come looking for quiet. The quiet had turned out to be listening, and the listening had turned out to be the answer to a question I had not known anyone was asking. I did not tell anyone that day or the next. This was not caution in the tactical sense. I was not calculating what to say and to whom and in what order to protect my position or my career or my claim to whatever the discovery meant in institutional terms. I was quiet about it because I had not yet found words for it that were honest. And I had spent my professional life refusing to publish translations I did not trust, and I extended that same standard to this. On the morning of the 90th day, the decommission day, the day the skeleton crew arrived and the research teams began clearing their equipment, I filed an amended anomaly report with Colonial Survey. It was 14 pages long, and it was written in the deliberate, precise, formal register that survey reports require, and it said, without flourish or embellishment, what I had found. I described the signal encoding. I described the resonance language structure and its relationship to the pre-colonial linguistic tradition I had been studying. I described the inner ring marker inscriptions and their interrogative grammar, and the way the construct's address pattern answered the question the markers posed. I described the 6 hours and 42 minutes, and what I had heard as accurately as I could render it, including the uncertainties and the places where my translation was approximate rather than precise. I did not describe what it felt like to be called first mind by something that had been waiting longer than my species had been alive. That part did not belong in a survey report. That part belonged to me, and to my mother's language, and to the long patience of whatever had built that thing, and set it on the plateau and waited, with a steadiness I could not begin to imagine, for someone quiet enough to hear it. The report went up the chain in the standard way. It sat in an administrative queue for 11 days, which is fast by colonial survey standards. Then it went to a review panel, which took 43 days. The review panel escalated it to a senior research division, which is not a thing that happens often. The senior research division sent a team to Veth Station, which is not a thing that happened at all, in my experience, for an outer reach anomaly file. I was not there when the team arrived. I had completed my decommission and returned to the transit hub by then, and I was in the middle of booking passage to the nearest research center to begin a formal study of the resonance language dataset when I received the communication that asked me to come back. I booked the other passage instead. The second time the construct spoke to me, it was different. Not the message, the quality of the encounter. The first time had been a disclosure, a transmission of information, the construct explaining itself because it had finally found someone capable of receiving the explanation. The second time was something more like a conversation. I used that word carefully. It was not a conversation in the sense of an equal exchange between two parties of comparable scale. The disparity was too great for that, in age, in complexity, in the category of thing I was, and the category of thing the construct was the representative of. But it was a conversation in the sense that there was exchange, that my listening was not entirely passive, that the construct was in some way attending to me as I was attending to it, and that the shape of what it disclosed was responsive to what I brought to the encounter. What I brought, the second time, was questions. The most urgent one was the simplest: why this language? My mother's tongue was not a colonial administrative language. It was not a scientific lingua franca. It had no strategic or institutional status. It was spoken with any fluency by perhaps a few thousand people across all of colonial space, most of them in a handful of dispersed communities that had maintained the tradition. across generations of diaspora. It was, by any conventional measure of linguistic importance, a minor survival. Why had the construct encoded its signal in this language? The answer required a longer silence than the question. When it came, I understood it in stages rather than all at once, because the concept did not map easily onto the categories I had available. The construct had not chosen the language had chosen the construct. Or rather, the relationship between the language and the construct signal had developed over time, an emergent alignment that had nothing to do with anyone's intention. The construct signal, the resonance language encoded in the mineral vibration, had a particular structure, a grammar of relationship and layered meaning, a sound system that used resonance as a carrier of information. Over the long span of years during which the construct had been broadcasting, human populations had settled and dispersed and changed around it. Most of them had used languages that did not resonate with the construct structure, and those populations had heard only the hum, only the background noise, only the thing they eventually filtered out. The populations whose linguistic tradition had, through their own independent development, arrived at a grammar and sound system that aligned with the construct's structure. Those populations had heard something more, not the full signal, not immediately, not without practice, but something, an undertone, a quality in the air near the construct that felt different from other air, a sense that the place was speaking, even if you could not hear the words. My mother's people had been one of those populations. They had settled near the construct's location during one of the early colonial expansion periods, and the elders of that community had noticed the quality of the plateau's air near the construct and had called the place, in their own language, by a name that translated approximately as the place where thinking has weight. They had incorporated the site into their practice, visiting it during periods of contemplation and study, not understanding what it was, only understanding that being near it produced a particular quality of attention. And over generations, the tradition of visiting the construct, of sitting near it, and being quiet near it and attending to it with the particular grammar of listening that the language itself encoded. That tradition had shaped the community's relationship to the signal, not decoded it, not cracked it, shaped it, the way a river shapes a channel, slowly and without any moment that could be called decisive, until the channel was ready for the water to flow. My mother had brought me to that plateau once when I was 6 years old. She had called it a research trip. She was writing her own paper on the site's inscription markers. I had sat near the construct for an afternoon while she worked, and I remembered thinking the hum was interesting, and going back to my book, and not thinking about it again for 35 years. The channel had already been prepared. The tradition had already done its work. All the construct had needed, after that, was for someone from that tradition to come back with the training to hear precisely what was being said. I had come back. I spent 4 months at Veth Station on that second posting. The colonial survey team was there, and they were professional and serious and genuinely curious, and I worked with them as closely as I could, sharing everything I had from the first encounter, helping them build instruments and protocols for studying the resonance language structure in ways that did not require one specific person's trained ear. That was important to me. The knowledge could not depend on my continued presence. Whatever the construct had said needed to be translatable by more than one person, through more than one path. Some of what I translated I will not reproduce here, not because it is secret, but because it requires more context than I can provide in this account. And I would rather say nothing than say something imprecise. What I will say is this: the construct was one of many, not identical constructs, not a uniform network, a distributed system of sites, placed at intervals across a region of space much larger than anything currently settled, each broadcasting its own version of the question, each tuned to a slightly different resonance language structure, each waiting for the specific population whose linguistic inheritance aligned with its particular signal. We had been finding these sites for decades. We had been cataloging them as geological anomalies, electromagnetic irregularities, objects of uncertain origin with no clear function. We had been filing them under administrative classifications for things we did not know what to do with, and leaving them in place, and moving on to things that seemed more urgent. Every single one of them was asking a question. The question was always the same, in its essential form, though the language differed from site to site. Who still carries this frequency? The civilization that had built them had not been asking this question out of sentiment. They had not been building monuments to their own existence or attempting to communicate their history to posterity. They had been doing something more urgent than that. Something that the Colonial Survey's anomaly files had been inadvertently cataloging for years, without anyone understanding what was being cataloged. They had been identifying which minds, across the long stretch of whatever time would follow them, retained the capacity they considered most critical. Not for those minds' benefit, for the benefit of whatever those minds were about to encounter. They had known something was coming. Not an enemy, that is not the right frame. Something that required a particular quality of mind to meet properly, to attend to, without the categories that normally prevent genuine encounter. Something that, if met with the wrong kind of mind, a loud mind, a certain mind, a mind already full of what things were before they had been allowed to say what they were, would be catastrophically misunderstood. They had built the filter system to ensure that when that encounter came, the minds doing the encountering would be the right kind. They had set it running across distances and timescales that meant they would almost certainly not be present to see what happened. And they had waited, encoded in resonance and mineral, and the long patience of a signal that does not care how long it takes for the answer to come back. I am 53 now. 12 years have passed since the morning I pressed my palm to the construct on the plateau at Veth Station and let 6 hours go by in something that felt like minutes. The senior research division that escalated my anomaly report has become something larger. We do not call it a division anymore. The work of identifying the construct sites. There are, at last count, 214 confirmed sites across colonial and pre-colonial survey records, and we believe there are more. And building the translation frameworks for each one's resonance language structure, and finding the communities whose linguistic traditions align with each site's particular signal, and doing the patient, unglamorous work of helping those communities understand what their elders had been sitting near for generations without knowing what it was. That work is larger than I am and larger than any team I could assemble. It will outlast me by a long way. I expect to spend the rest of my working life on a fraction of it. The communities, when we find them, are always already there. That is the thing that strikes me every time. We do not discover the relationship between a community's linguistic tradition and a construct site. We find a community that has already been living in proximity to the site, already incorporating it into their practice, already shaped by it in ways they have words for, even if they do not have the framework to understand those words fully. The construct found them across the years. The filter did its work. We are not creating connections. We are learning to see the ones that already exist. The first person at each new site to hear the full signal clearly is always someone from the relevant community. Always someone who grew up speaking the aligned language as a living practice, not an academic study. Always someone who learned it from a parent or grandparent who learned it the same way, uninterrupted, the inheritance intact across whatever distances and difficulties the community had traversed. I think about that. I think about my mother teaching me her language at the kitchen table, patient and unhurried, in the same way her mother had taught her. I think about the community that had named the plateau, the place where thinking has weight, and had kept visiting it across generations, for reasons that were real to them, even when they could not have told you the technical reason they were real. They were not wrong to visit. They were not superstitious or confused or attaching significance to something that had no significance. They were doing exactly what the construct needed them to do, which was maintaining the channel, keeping the alignment active, ensuring that when someone finally arrived with the specific combination of training and inheritance required to hear the signal fully, the capacity to hear it had not atrophied from disuse. They were keeping something alive that they could not entirely see because they understood, at some level below the articulable, that it was worth keeping. I am asked sometimes what the construct said, the full content of the disclosure, the thing it had been waiting to transmit across all those years. I give an honest answer to that. We are still translating it. The 6 hours of the first encounter produced a data set that has kept a team of 12 linguists, 3 cognitive scientists, and 2 information theorists occupied for 11 years, and will keep their successors occupied for a long time after they are finished. The translation is not simple, not because the language is intractable, but because the concepts it carries require us to build new frameworks before we can accurately represent them. And building new frameworks is the kind of work that resists being rushed. What I can say, honestly, is this. The construct did not tell me I was special. It did not tell me my people were special. It did not designate a bloodline or a throne or a covenant or a seal. It designated a capacity, and it designated it in the same way that a tuning fork designates a frequency, not as a value judgment, but as a statement of physical fact. You carry this. You have, through practice and inheritance and the long, patient work of maintaining a tradition that did not always seem urgent, kept something alive that was needed. Here it is. Now do something with it. The what? Of doing something with it is the translation work, and the community finding work, and the site cataloging work, and the framework building work that is proceeding at whatever pace it can proceed at, which is never as fast as I would like, and always faster than I feared. That is the practical answer to the question. The other answer, the one I turn over in my mind late at night when the work has stopped for a few hours and I am somewhere quiet, is that the doing something with it is, in a way, already underway. The construct found me not because I did something remarkable, but because I did something very ordinary for a very long time. I kept listening. I stayed at a table with a patient teacher. I sat near a thing I did not understand, and let the not understanding be present without filling it with a conclusion. I spent 3 years in a posting that was professionally defensible, but personally driven by something I did not have a category for, and I waited for the category to emerge from the thing itself rather than imposing one from outside. This is not, I understand, a capacity unique to me. I am not telling you this story because I am the extraordinary one in it. I am telling you this story because the construct told me, in my mother's language, in the resonance grammar of relationship and layered meaning, in the specific quality of sound that my body recognizes before my mind has finished processing, that this capacity is not rare among human minds. It is underdeveloped, it is undertrained, it is undervalued in an era and a culture that rewards the loud and certain over the patient and attentive. But it is not rare. The construct has been broadcasting to our species for longer than our species has had writing, and it has found answers in every era, in every region, in communities spread across colonial space in ways that look, from a cartographic perspective, almost like a pattern. The filter has been working. The channel has been maintained in community after community, in tradition after tradition, in the patient and unspectacular work of parents teaching children a language at a kitchen table, in the practice of sitting near something and not rushing the silence, in the discipline, because it is a discipline, as much as any formal study, of attending to what is being said rather than what you expected to hear. We are not at the end of this. I want to be clear about that. The 214 confirmed construct sites are not the end of the inventory, and the translation work at each site is not close to complete. And the encounter that the original builders were preparing for, whatever that is, whatever shape it will take when it arrives, is not something I expect to see concluded in my lifetime, or in the lifetime of my children, or in the lifetime of my children's children. What I know is that when the encounter comes, the minds doing the encountering will include some that have been shaped across generations by exactly the kind of patient and relational attention that the original builders considered most essential. Some of those minds will speak languages that have maintained, through diaspora and difficulty, and the long indifference of institutions that did not understand what they were preserving. A grammar of listening that matches the grammar of the thing they will be required to meet. Some of them will have sat at some point in their lives near something that hummed, near something they did not understand, that asked nothing of them except their continued presence and stayed. I think now about the Signals team and their 18 days. I think about this without judgment, because the judgment would be wrong, and I have enough precision in my training to know when a conclusion is wrong. They were not less than me. They brought better instruments and more resources than I had. They asked exactly the questions their training told them to ask, and those questions were reasonable questions, and the answers they found were true as far as they went. They left because they had found what their instruments could find, and there was nothing left to find that their instruments could reach. That is not a failure. That is the correct behavior for a particular kind of mind, doing a particular kind of work. The Signals team's work gave me a foundation I built on. The electromagnetic frequency they measured was real. The construction age they recorded was accurate. The artificial origin determination was correct. Everything they wrote in their report was true. They just did not hear what was underneath it. I did not hear what was underneath it for 2 years either. I am not recounting this to make myself look patient and perceptive. I am recounting it because what eventually allowed me to hear was not a superior technique or a more sophisticated instrument. It was the specific alignment of my body and my training and my inheritance with the particular way the construct had chosen to say what it needed to say, and that alignment had been built, slowly and by many people across many years, long before I arrived on the plateau. My mother does not know, in full technical detail, what happened on Veth Station. She knows the outline, that I found something, that it was significant, that it involved the language she taught me. She is old now, and the technical detail would require a longer conversation than her health easily permits. But when I went to see her after the first posting, before the review panel, and the escalation, and the second posting, and everything that followed, I sat with her at the kitchen table the way I had sat there as a child, and I told her what I could. She listened the way she always listened, without hurrying me, without inserting what she thought I was going to say before I had said it, with the complete and settled attention that had always made her, for me, the best linguist I have ever known, regardless of her formal credentials. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in her language, our language, the phrase that she had always used when she was teaching me at the moment when a lesson had finally settled fully into place. I will not translate it. It is hers, and it is ours. And some things are more accurately kept than translated. But it meant, approximately, you see now why we kept it. The construct on the plateau at Veth Station still hums. The skeleton crew that replaced the research team has learned to hear it as background noise within the first day, the way recycled air becomes background noise, the way a ship's hull under thrust eventually disappears from attention. The team we have assigned to the site now is small, 3 people, one of whom speaks my mother's language with sufficient fluency to serve as primary contact, 2 of whom are working on the translation dataset. The mineral shelf 3 meters from the construct's base has, over the years of people sitting on it, acquired a slight polish, the surface worn smooth by clothing and hands and the particular weight of sustained attention. I think about the construct continuing to broadcast its question across the plateau and into the cold silver air, the same way it has been broadcasting for longer than anyone alive can meaningfully imagine. I think about the question it is asking, not of me, not of my team, not of the current moment, but of the long future, the way it has always been asking into the long future. and about the answer it is waiting for, and about the kinds of minds that will give that answer when the time comes. Minds that were shaped by the work done now, by the catalog and the translation frameworks, and the community finding, and the patient transmission of traditions that do not always look urgent, across kitchen tables, and in the language of people who had no name for what they were maintaining but understood, in the way that the body understands things before the mind has found words, that it was worth maintaining. We did not choose this. No one made a decision at some deliberate moment to preserve a capacity across 1,000 years of diaspora and difficulty so that one day a linguist on a cold plateau could press his palm to something that had been waiting and hear what it had to say. It simply persisted, the way real things persist, not through grand declarations or institutional mandates or the formal recognition of anyone with the authority to grant formal recognition, but through the daily, ordinary, unglamorous practice of people who understood that something mattered, even when they could not fully articulate why, and who passed that understanding on to the next person and the next, and did not let it drop. The construct called me first mind, because I had arrived at a moment of first hearing, the moment of genuine initial encounter, when what had been background became foreground, when the question behind the frequency finally found ears that could hold its shape. But first is not singular. First hearing happens again and again, at every new site, in every new community. For every new person who arrives at the moment of genuine encounter with something that has been patient, long enough to wait for them, the filter keeps working, the channel keeps being maintained, the question keeps finding its answers, one by one, across the spread of human settlement, in the places where the hum is present and someone stays quiet long enough to hear what is underneath it. The construct did not need a king. It did not need a warlord or a founder or an heir to an ancient and forbidden bloodline. It needed a witness, someone patient enough and quiet enough and trained by the right tradition to stand in the presence of something not yet understood and say, without retreating into what they already knew, I am listening. I will stay until I hear you. We are the answer to a question asked before we existed, by minds so far from our own in time and scale that the distance defeats imagination. We are here. We are listening. That is enough. There is something I have not yet described, and I should describe it, because it is the part that people who work in the field ask about most often. Not the scholars, not the administrators, but the field workers. The people who go to the sites and sit near the constructs and do the patient daily work of building translation datasets and finding the communities and maintaining the channel. They ask about the second question. I have called it the first message, the disclosure, the explanation of the construct's origin and purpose and the nature of its signal. That is accurate as far as it goes. But the disclosure was not the only thing the construct communicated in those 6 hours and 42 minutes. There was a second layer, embedded deeper in the resonance grammar, presented after the explanation, in a structure that I initially interpreted as a form of conclusion, but that subsequent analysis, over 11 years, has revealed to be something more like a preparation. The construct told me what was coming. I am going to be precise about what I mean by this, because I am aware that the claim admits of misinterpretation, and I would rather be tediously precise than easily misunderstood. It did not tell me a date. It did not tell me an origin point, or a trajectory, or a set of observable signatures by which an arrival might be detected in advance. It did not give me the kind of information that a signals team could use to point an instrument at a region of space and confirm or deny. What it gave me was a description of quality, a description of what the encounter, when it comes, will require of the minds meeting it. What kind of attention, what kind of grammar, what kind of capacity to be present to something genuinely unknown without collapsing the unknown prematurely into the already known. It described this in the resonance grammar of my mother's language, in the layered and relational way that language builds meaning, and what it said, what I have spent 11 years working backward from, assembling the framework to represent accurately, is this. What is coming is not an adversary. It is not a test in the sense of something designed to evaluate and grade. It is not a communication in the sense of a message with a sender and a receiver, and a defined content that can be decoded, verified, and filed. It is, in the construct's language, something closer to a weather system. Not in the sense of something random or indifferent, but in the sense of something that exists at a scale, and in a mode that will not conform to any category we currently have for it. Something that will require us to be genuinely open to what it is before we can interact with it usefully. Something that, approached with the wrong kind of mind, will simply pass through us, not maliciously, but the way a signal passes through a receiver that is not tuned to its frequency, without contact, without exchange, without the encounter that the original builders considered so important that they spent what must have been an extraordinary investment of time and resource and intentionality on building the preparation for it. I am aware that this description raises more questions than it answers. I am aware that 11 years of translation work have produced, so far, a framework that is accurate enough to tell us what we do not yet know more clearly than it tells us what we do. I am aware that the scientists and strategists and administrators who have been brought into this project in various capacities want more specificity than I can provide, and that the gap between what they want and what the translation can currently offer is a source of institutional friction that I navigate daily. I offer them the same answer I give myself when the late-night quiet brings me to the same frustration. The constructs builders did not tell us what was coming because knowing what was coming is not the preparation. The preparation is becoming the kind of minds that can meet the unknown thing properly. You cannot prepare for an encounter by studying the thing you have not yet encountered. You prepare by developing, through sustained practice, the capacity to be genuinely present to whatever that thing turns out to be. The preparation is the work we are doing now. There is something I have been asked more times than I can count that I want to answer directly before I finish. People ask, what happens now? Now that the constructs have been found, now that the translation work is underway, now that the communities are known and the channel maintenance is understood to matter, what is the practical action? What do we do next? The answer is exactly as undramatic as the work that preceded it. We maintain. We keep the traditions from being lost. We ensure that the communities who have been doing this work across generations have the support to continue. We build the translation frameworks accurately, without rushing the accuracy for the sake of having something presentable. We find the other sites, and there are more. We know there are more, and we sit near them, and we wait, and we let the right people find the signal in their own time. We do not try to force the answer. We do not try to extract the full content of the construct's disclosure before the framework is ready to hold it accurately. We do not treat this as a strategic asset to be controlled or a discovery to be owned. We treat it as what it is, a message sent across an incomprehensible distance by minds who understood that the message's receipt mattered more than their credit for sending it, to minds they would never meet but had taken extraordinary care to prepare for. We honor that care by being worthy of it. That is what I was called. First mind. To do. Not to lead a program, not to manage a research division, not to represent humanity in any formal or institutional sense. To witness. To carry what was heard and carry it carefully without distortion, until it could be carried by more hands than mine. I am 53 years old. I have, if the health data is accurate, a reasonable number of working years left. I intend to use them on this. Not because I was chosen. The construct designated a capacity, not a destiny. But because I have looked at the work and found it worth doing. For the same reason, my mother maintained her language and my grandmother maintained it before her. And every person in that tradition maintained it before them. Because it is worth maintaining. Because something is still asking. Because we are still here to answer.